A racist cop laughed as he shoved a black man into the back of his squad car. But the moment he stepped into the precinct, reality hit him like a train. He had just arrested the most powerful man in the room. The city was alive with movement, cars honking, pedestrians rushing, the scent of fresh coffee mixing with the dampness of the morning air. Among the crowd, a tall black man in a dark navy suit walked calmly down the street. His presence was strong, yet unassuming, blending in with the busy world around him. No one in this neighborhood knew who he was, and that was exactly what he wanted. This was his city, his new department, his first day as the newly appointed chief of police. Nathaniel Carter had spent his entire career fighting for this moment. He wasn't born into power, didn't have connections that cleared the way for him. Everything he had, he earned. Growing up in a tough neighborhood, he learned early on that justice didn't always come easy, especially for people who looked like him. He saw good men beaten down by the very system meant to protect them. He saw corruption buried beneath polished badges, and he made a promise to himself. One day, he would change that. Now, after 2 decades of service, countless arrests, and a reputation built on integrity, he had been chosen to lead the city's police force. But today, he wasn't walking into headquarters with flashing cameras and a grand introduction. No, today, he wanted to see the truth. So, he left the ceremony suit behind. No official car, no security detail, no badges to signal his authority. Just him, walking the streets, stepping into his new kingdom as an ordinary man. Because he needed to know, how did his officers treat people when they thought no one was watching? The other side of the city. A few blocks away, Officer Ryan Calloway leaned against his squad car, tapping his fingers against his belt. Tall, broad-shouldered, with the classic clean-cut look of an all-American cop, he exuded the kind of confidence that came with unchecked power. He had been on the force for years and had a reputation that made rookies uneasy. Another day, another round of keeping the streets clean, he muttered to his partner, adjusting the sunglasses resting on his nose. To Calloway, the job wasn't about justice, it was about control. He believed in a certain order, an unwritten rule that dictated who belonged where. And when he saw Nathaniel Carter, a tall black man in an expensive suit, walking through a part of town where, in his mind, he didn't belong, something in him itched. The moment of judgment happened in an instant. He stepped forward, whistling sharply. "Hey, you, hold up." Nathaniel turned, his expression unreadable. "Is there a problem, officer?" Calloway's eyes scanned him, searching for a reason, any reason, to justify what he was about to do. "Let's see some ID." Nathaniel didn't move. He knew exactly what was happening. He had seen it too many times before. This wasn't about law enforcement. This was about power. "I don't believe I've done anything that requires identification," Nathaniel replied, his voice calm, measured. But calm didn't matter. Logic didn't matter. Calloway had already decided. "Either you show me your ID, or we're going to have a problem," Calloway said, stepping closer, hand hovering near his holster. The city bustled around them, oblivious to the storm brewing in this small corner of the street. Passers-by glanced, but quickly looked away, unwilling to get involved. This was how it always happened, an abuse of power in plain sight, hidden by silence. Nathaniel exhaled slowly. He could have ended this now. A single sentence, "I'm your new boss," and Calloway's world would have come crashing down. But he didn't say it, because he wanted to see how far this officer was willing to go. The tension in the air was thick, but Calloway didn't feel it. He had done this 100 times before. The casual stop, the quiet intimidation, The moment where the suspect realized they had no power here. Except this time, the man in front of him wasn't nervous. Nathaniel Carter stood firm, his gaze unwavering, his hands still resting at his sides. He didn't flinch. He didn't reach for his pockets. He didn't do any of the things Calloway expected, and that irritated him. "Maybe you didn't hear me," Calloway said, his voice sharpening. "I told you to show me some ID." "And I told you," Nathaniel replied smoothly, "that I haven't done anything that requires it." A muscle twitched in Calloway's jaw. This was supposed to be simple. A quick check, a little pressure, maybe even a pat-down. Most men folded at this point, understanding it was easier to comply than to push back. But this one? He was stalling, acting like he had a choice. Calloway didn't like that. "Put your hands where I can see them," he ordered, his voice rising. A few people on the sidewalk slowed down, sensing the shift in the atmosphere. Nathaniel sighed. This was the moment. He could de-escalate. He could pull rank. End this right here. But if this is how Calloway treated a well-dressed black man in broad daylight, what did he do to those who had no power, no voice? Nathaniel wanted to see. So, he let it happen. "I don't have anything in my pockets," he said evenly. "But if you feel the need to check, go ahead." Calloway didn't hesitate. He grabbed Nathaniel's wrist, yanking his arm roughly as he spun him around. The movement was too forceful, unnecessary. But that was the point. It wasn't about finding a weapon. It was about humiliation. Nathaniel could feel the stares now. People watching, some with phones in their hands, but none of them stepping forward. They had seen this scene before. They knew how it ended. "Spread your legs," Calloway ordered, patting him down with an aggressive familiarity. Nathaniel remained still, waiting, watching. His silence only seemed to enrage the officer more. Calloway stepped back, frustration flickering across his face when he found nothing. "All right, tough guy," he said. "Let's take this downtown." Nathaniel turned his head slightly. "For what charge?" "I don't owe you an explanation," Calloway snapped, already reaching for his cuffs. "Hands behind your back." Nathaniel didn't resist as the cold metal snapped around his wrists. The same wrists that would soon be signing Calloway's suspension papers. A young officer, barely out of training, stood a few feet away, watching with hesitation. He knew something was wrong. The man they were arresting hadn't done anything, hadn't resisted, hadn't even raised his voice. And yet here he was, hands locked behind his back, being shoved toward the squad car. The young officer hesitated, then took a step forward. "Hey, Ryan, maybe we should—" "Stay out of it," Calloway interrupted. "This guy thinks he's smart. Let's see how smart he is sitting in a holding cell." Nathaniel let out a slow breath as Calloway tightened his grip on his arm. He wondered if the officer would still be this confident in the next 10 minutes. The squad car door slammed shut. Nathaniel sat inside, his face calm, his posture relaxed. He could see Calloway through the windshield, grinning as he spoke with his partner. Then the car started moving, heading toward the one place Calloway thought he had control. The precinct. The squad car moved through the streets, sirens off. Just another routine arrest in a city that had seen too many of them. From the back seat, Nathaniel watched the world blur past, his hands still cuffed behind his back, his expression unreadable. He could feel the weight of the metal against his wrists, the cold bite of authority, misused. Calloway glanced at him through the rearview mirror, smirking. "You've got nothing to say now, huh? Thought you were a tough guy back there." Nathaniel didn't respond. He had seen men like Calloway before, men who mistook their badge for a crown, their authority for absolute power. They never expected consequences. Never imagined that one bad decision could unravel everything. Beside Calloway, his partner shifted uncomfortably. Officer Dean was younger, still fresh enough to believe in the ideals of the badge. What they had just done didn't sit right with him. "Ryan," Dean said carefully, "are we actually booking him? I mean, we don't even have a charge." Calloway scoffed. "We'll think of something. Loitering, obstruction. Hell, I'll say he resisted if I have to." The guy had an attitude. Dean swallowed hard, gripping the steering wheel. But he didn't resist. Calloway turned to look at him, his smirk fading into something harder. "Listen, kid. You want to last in this department, you learn to stop questioning everything. I know what I'm doing." Nathaniel tilted his head slightly, taking in the exchange. One man too arrogant to see what was coming, another too afraid to stop it. As they pulled up to the precinct, Calloway stepped out first, adjusting his belt with an air of satisfaction. He yanked the door open, grabbing Nathaniel's arm and hauling him out. "Let's go," he said, pushing him forward. Nathaniel walked calmly, his posture still composed, even with his hands behind his back. The moment they stepped inside the station, the energy in the room shifted. The front desk officer looked up from her paperwork and froze. The sergeant standing by the bulletin board stiffened. Conversations halted mid-sentence. Officers turned, eyes widening in slow realization. Calloway, oblivious, kept walking, dragging Nathaniel through the precinct like a trophy. "Got ourselves a real smartass here," he announced. "Thinks he can walk around like he owns the place." A heavy silence settled over the room. Then, "Ryan," someone said, voice tight with disbelief. "What the hell are you doing?" Calloway frowned, looking around. "What?" The front desk officer stood up, hands gripping the counter as she stared at Nathaniel. "Take, office those cuffs." Calloway blinked. He let out a short, incredulous laugh. "Relax, we're just processing him. What's the big—" Then his gaze followed theirs. And finally, he saw it. The framed photo hanging on the bulletin board, the newspaper clipping taped beside it. "Welcome our new police chief, Nathaniel Carter." The world around Calloway seemed to lurch. The room wasn't silent anymore. It was a deafening absence of noise, the kind that came before an explosion. His throat went dry. His mind scrambled for a way to explain, to justify, to undo what had already been done. Nathaniel turned, slowly, meeting his gaze for the first time since they left the street. He didn't have to say anything. The weight of the moment crushed Calloway all on its own. Dean took an instinctive step back. His face had gone pale. The sergeant, a man who had served in the force for decades, stepped forward. His voice was razor-sharp. "You arrested our police chief?" Calloway stammered, his arrogance fracturing into something desperate. "He didn't say who he was." Nathaniel finally spoke. "Should I have had to?" Calloway's mouth opened, then closed. He knew the answer. They all did. Someone rushed forward with keys, unlocking the cuffs with shaking hands. The moment the metal clicked free, Nathaniel rubbed his wrists, then reached into his jacket pocket, the same pocket Calloway had refused to let him touch. He pulled out his badge, held it up for everyone to see. No one in the room was breathing. Nathaniel's voice was quiet, controlled, but it cut through the air like a blade. "This is how you treat people when you think no one is watching." Calloway's face burned red. "Sir, I didn't realize." "That's the problem," Nathaniel interrupted, stepping closer. Calloway shrank back. "You didn't realize. You didn't bother to. You saw a black man in a nice suit walking down the street, and you decided that was a crime." Calloway's breath came in shallow gulps. He glanced around, but no one was coming to his defense. "Sir," the sergeant spoke carefully, "what do you want to do?" Nathaniel didn't answer right away. He let the silence stretch, let Calloway feel it. Then he tucked his badge away, adjusted his sleeves, and smiled. A smile that said everything. Calloway's career had just ended before his very eyes. The silence in the precinct was suffocating. Every officer in the room stood frozen, watching the man they had unknowingly humiliated, the man who, with a single word, could end their careers. Nathaniel Carter didn't rush. He let the weight of the moment press down on Calloway. Let the reality of his mistake sink in, inch by inch, breath by breath. Calloway's face was pale now, his confidence shattered, his body rigid as if he could physically stop the consequences from coming. He had spent years believing he was untouchable, but now he was standing in front of the one man who could ruin him. Nathaniel took a step forward. Calloway flinched. "You thought I was nobody." His voice was calm, too calm. "That's why you stopped me." Calloway swallowed hard. "Sir, you saw my skin, my suit. You didn't ask questions. You didn't care who I was. Because to you, I wasn't a man. I was a suspect." The words hit like a hammer. Nathaniel could see it in the way Calloway's eyes darted, searching for a way out that didn't exist. Calloway started, but nothing came. There was nothing to say. Nathaniel turned, sweeping his gaze across the room. Some officers looked away. Others stood rigid, guilt heavy on their shoulders. "How many times has this happened before?" Nathaniel asked, his voice cutting through the silence like a blade. "How many men like me have been stopped, humiliated, arrested, just because they didn't fit your idea of belonging?" No one answered. He let out a slow breath. He already knew. Nathaniel turned back to Calloway. "You don't deserve that badge," he said simply. Calloway flinched like he had been struck. His chest rose and fell quickly, panic creeping in. "Sir, please, it was a mistake. Nathaniel didn't blink. The only mistake was assuming you wouldn't get caught. The precinct was dead silent. Then, "Sergeant," Nathaniel said, his voice steady. "Place Officer Calloway on immediate suspension. Effective now." A visible ripple went through the room. Calloway's body locked up. "Wait. Now." The sergeant didn't hesitate. He turned to Calloway. "Hand over your badge and weapon." Calloway's breath came in short, sharp bursts. His hands hovered near his belt, as if his body refused to believe what was happening. "Ryan, now." The sergeant's tone left no room for argument. With shaking fingers, Calloway unhooked his badge. His grip on it was so tight his knuckles turned white. The badge he once flashed like a shield, the one thing that made him feel invincible, was now being stripped away in front of everyone. Slowly, he set it down. His gun followed. The room exhaled. Nathaniel didn't move, didn't gloat. He simply watched. Because men like Calloway never thought they would face consequences. They believed the system would protect them. But not today. Today, justice had a name. Calloway stood frozen, his hands hovering over the desk where his badge and weapon now lay. The weight of what had just happened crushed down on him, his face drained of all color. He had walked into this precinct with absolute confidence, convinced of his authority. Now, he was nothing. The sergeant stepped forward, his voice cold and official. "You are suspended effective immediately, pending a full internal investigation. Leave the premises." Calloway's breath hitched. He looked around, searching for support, for someone, anyone, to step in and defend him. But the room remained silent. No one moved. No one spoke. Even his partner, Officer Dean, stood stiff and unmoving, eyes fixed on the floor. Calloway let out a shaky breath. His lips parted as if to protest, but there was nothing left to say. He had played his hand, and he had lost. Slowly, he turned and walked toward the exit. The air felt heavier with each step. The same officers who once laughed at his jokes, who stood by him in silence while he abused his power, now refused to meet his eyes. The doors swung shut behind him. Nathaniel exhaled, rolling his shoulders, feeling the tension in the room settle. He hadn't needed to shout. He hadn't needed to argue. The truth had spoken for itself. A few officers shifted uncomfortably. Others looked at him with something different now. Respect. Or maybe fear. Nathaniel turned to the sergeant. Have the department's internal affairs team review all of Calloway's past arrests, every report, every complaint. The sergeant nodded without hesitation. A beat passed, then another. Nathaniel let his gaze sweep across the room. This isn't just about him, he said finally. His voice was calm, measured, but it carried weight. If you stood by and let it happen, you're part of the problem. No one answered. They didn't need to. Nathaniel glanced at the badge still lying on the desk, then turned and walked away. Because power wasn't about how loud you could be. It was about knowing exactly when to speak, and when to let silence do the rest. Nathaniel stepped out of the precinct, inhaling the crisp evening air. The weight of what had just transpired settled over him, but there was no satisfaction, only resolve. Justice wasn't about revenge. It wasn't about humiliation. It was about setting a new standard. As he walked toward his car, a young black man standing nearby hesitated before speaking. "Sir, what you did in there." He swallowed hard, as if struggling to find the right words. That meant something. Nathaniel met his gaze. Then make sure it keeps meaning something. The young man nodded, his fists clenched, not in anger, but in determination. Nathaniel got into his car, gripping the wheel for a moment before starting the engine. Today had been about one officer, but tomorrow? Tomorrow would be about the entire system, because power unchecked is power abused. And change, real change, doesn't come from one moment. It comes from what happens next. What do you think? If you were in Nathaniel's position, how would you have handled it? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. And if you believe stories like this need to be told, hit that like button, share this video, and don't forget to subscribe.